I can't say I'm surprised that Mr. Duncan, who has been nominated by a president who's called Mexicans racist and drug dealers, President Trump and Mr. Duncan share the same extreme political ideology, especially regarding their view of immigrants. Mr. Duncan, in an amicus brief challenging the deferred action for parents of Americans and lawful permanent residents, wrote that permitting DAPA, the acronym for that program, to go into effect would exacerbate the problem of violent crime by unauthorized immigrants. This position advances the false and offensive narrative that a majority of immigrants are violent criminals. In fact, DAPA was a program that would have allowed the parent of a U.S. citizen, a lawful permanent resident who had lived in the United States continuously for years and passed a criminal background check, to remain in the United States with legal status and a work permit. This program was never implemented, but it would have kept families together. And to suggest that it would have benefited criminals and threatened public safety is just plain wrong. It fits with the Republican Party's misleading and racist attacks on immigrants in this country. Mr. Duncan makes these arguments despite overwhelming evidence that immigrants commit less crime than native-born Americans. And numerous law enforcement entities have voiced their support for DAPA because the program actually advances public safety by encouraging cooperation and trust between immigrant communities and the police. A year after voicing his opposition to DAPA, Mr. Duncan submitted another amicus brief. This time, he argued against the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, known as DACA, claiming that it was unconstitutional. So we know where Mr. Duncan stands in stereotyping immigrants. But Mr. Duncan is not just hostile to immigrants. He represented North Carolina in its defense of a discriminatory voting law, urging the Supreme Court to hear the case. In the brief, Duncan wrote, quote, "The Constitution does not allow the sins of civil rights era legislators to be visited on their grandchildren and great-grandchildren," close quote. Yet, the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals had found that the law was enacted with discriminatory intent and, quote, targeted African Americans with almost surgical precision. Mr. Duncan appeared to have clearly missed the point as to who the real victims were. In another voting rights case, Duncan argued that Texas' restrictive voter ID law helped to, quote, prevent voter fraud. Although this myth has been debunked over and over and over again, the Republican Party, President Trump, and Mr. Duncan continued to perpetuate this lie to the American people in an effort to suppress the voting rights of others. I would be remiss if I ended these remarks without noting Mr. Duncan's extremely troubling record on reproductive rights and his hostility towards the LGBTQ community. He has continuously fought to restrict women's access to contraceptives. In 2013, he criticized the Affordable Care Act's inclusion of contraceptives as an essential benefit for the health and economic success of society, particularly women. Given that he holds these views, it seems fitting that Mr. Duncan would serve as the lead counsel in Hobby Lobby versus Burwell, in which he argued that corporations have the right to deny contraceptive coverage to their employees. I'm sure he was pleased when the Supreme Court agreed with him. Yet, when the Supreme Court handed down its decision in Obergefell versus Hodges, which recognized same-sex marriage as a fundamental right, Duncan said that such a decision, quote, raises a question about the legitimacy of the court. This comment cuts to the core of my opposition to Mr. Duncan, his disregard and contempt for judicial precedent he disagrees with. Even before the Supreme Court considered same-sex marriage, Duncan warned that if the courts granted the right to same-sex marriage, that they might have to grant the right to marry a first cousin or a 13-year-old. To clarify, this is a man who believes that the rights of a corporation to deny employees health benefits is perfectly constitutional, yet granting the right to same-sex marriage will lead us down a road to child marriage. Mr. President, I know my colleagues are on a furious quest to pack the federal bench with conservative judges. judges, some of them who hold outrageous views, views out of step with the American public. I do not trust, nor does his record suggest, that once Mr. Duncan puts on the judicial robe, that he will uphold the rule of law for all Americans and not those who just share his ideological views. I do not believe that he can be an unbiased jurist, and that's exactly why the President nominated him and his supporters will vote for him. I urge my colleagues to oppose the nomination of Mr. Duncan.